Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Secret Origins of Mint Condition. I am your host, James, and we are broadcasting from the steps of Mount Salea today because we are celebrating. I got permission from the Vulcan High Council to do this. They say it's pretty illogical to do a podcast, but we're still doing it. So, joining me to talk about what we're celebrating, the 40th anniversary of the search for Spock, I have Starfleet's entire J team, or the Secret Origins of Mint Condition Starfleet entire J team. So first joining me is, of course, regular co-host and contributor to the show, Joe is here.
Hey folks, how you doing?
And also joining us is our resident pop culture professor, our Starfleet official, lawyer? And emissary from afar, Jack is with us as well.
Hello all.
Also joining us is regular contributor to the podcast, regular co-host of this Star Trek edition, regular contributor to Trash Compactor, regular contributor to TARDIS Rubbish. John is here with us as well.
I love contributing.
And finally, recording a Star Trek episode where he's no longer on trial, the newly reinstated Captain Josh Bernhard, who also has the podcast Trash Compactor and TARDIS Rubbish. Josh, thank you for coming and being on the show today.
No, thank you for having me. I love talking Trek, so any opportunity to do so.
Yes.
So, 40 years of The Search for Spock. I think this might be the very first Star Trek movie I ever saw. I have vague recollections of actually being homesick from school and my mom renting this on pay-per-view, because I have vague recollections of Christopher Lloyd as a Klingon trying to strangle a giant worm with his bare hands. That's like the earliest memory I have. And then I don't think one of the earliest memories I have of like watching like pop culture or science fiction. And I don't think I really picked up Star Trek again until the next generation, because I think at the age of 4 years old, Search for Spock is not the most, I don't know, it didn't engage me at the time. But I will say, having rewatched this movie for this podcast, I personally think it's really good. It's a really like solid story. I personally can get into it. I personally feel like we've talked about, obviously, in great depth in the motion picture, how James T. Kirk is portrayed. We even got a little bit into how he's portrayed in Wrath of Khan, where he's sort of the older statesman. He doesn't know his place in the world. He's a little bit whiny about his place in the world. But I feel like this is like classic Kirk. Like, he takes action. He takes risks. He gives a damn about the rule book. So, I'm going to stop rambling on and throw it over to my guest. So, Joe, since you're the senior Starfleet officer on the bridge right now, you probably saw this when it came out. So, what was your first impressions of Search for Spock?
I did see it when it came out in 1984 at a theater up on Woodhaven Boulevard in Rego Park. I can't remember the name of the theater, but took my mom and dad to see it. As a matter of fact, my mom always loved Star Trek. My father never got it. He didn't like the movie, but I took him out for dinner after that. He was happy. But when it came out, it was the logical sequel to The Wrath of Khan. I enjoyed it. When I look back at it historically, when you look back at the quote-unquote Spock trilogy, Wrath of Khan, Search for Spock, Voyage Home, I think this might be, and this is not even fair to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, the weakest of the three. Because look what it's compared to, The Wrath of Khan, and my all-time favorite, anything of Star Trek, The Voyage Home. So I mean, this movie, it works on a couple of different levels, and for me, the final act is the best part of the film. Obviously, they really nailed the final act in this film, and I just thought, watching it again yesterday and this morning, over the 2 days span, I just love the entire Vulcan sequence. The way it was filmed, the writing, the directing, and it's beautifully done. It's gorgeous to look at. Where there's other parts of the film that are not, and I'll get to that later. I thought I think they spent all their money on Vulcan in this film, their production value money. But that said, I still like it. I still think it's a very good film. Josh, I think it's better than the Star Trek: The Motion Picture. I think it's better than Star Trek, the worst Star Trek movie of all time, which would be the one that comes.
Final Frontier.
Final Frontier. That's not even a movie. I don't know what the hell that is. But this is a damn good Star Trek movie. It's just a good film. It really is. So.
I agree. I think the Vulcan sequence is the best sequence too. I don't know if it's because I'm older. I actually got a little choked up watching it this
I
time
did
around.
too. I did too,
You
James.
know, especially as soon as he turns around and James Horner's music comes on, I was
Hmm.
like, oh, am I getting like a little choked up about this movie?
Every time that eyebrow goes up, I lose it.
So,
Every time.
John, what's your impressions of the search for Spock 40 or not 40 years later? Yeah, 40 years later.
I can't handle that. First of all,
Oh.
this movie was not 40 years ago. I don't care what facts say. This is not 40 years ago, and I will stick by that.
My back tells
I
me
go
it's
through
40
a
years
personal
ago.
crisis here. Um, uh, I remember this movie because I think we've gone to this my first Star Trek movie that I really remembered watching. I think was Star Trek 4, which I think is a great entry point for a kid.
Oh, yeah.
Being about 8 or 9, ish. That's such a great entry point. And then renting Wrath of Khan, which is this intense dark movie, and to me, this was the sequel. It was like, oh, well, this answers a lot of what happens in Wrath of Khan, and it became one of those movies that I just watched over and over and over again as a kid and as a teenager because it to me was um, uh, more fun than Wrath of Khan. Not necessarily like a better constructed movie or a better story or more uh, uh, but but it had had Star Trek fun. You mentioned Kirk doing what Kirk does. So it brought back some of that fun and the quippy lines, which again they gave Scotty and McCoy their fun quips again, and that was in the absence of Spock. Uh, there wasn't the McCoy
Right.
Spock rivalry, and that they delightfully bring back in Star Trek 4. So it was a fun film, and I just remember that's why it was a go-to watch again, because it wasn't like the intensity of Wrath of Khan, which you sort of had to be more committed to, because I'm going to watch the Enterprise get its ass kicked. Granted, that happens here, but it's a different context.
Mm.
And then Kirk just defeated. This was the fun adventure, followed by the dramatic loss of the Enterprise, but I didn't feel it harshly like it was this horrible loss of everything else. I complained about it. I said, why can't the Enterprise just kick ass? I think I've said this in other podcasts too, that they never let the Enterprise just kick ass. They even say like, oh, this class, Enterprise can outgun any Klingon small bird of prey. And then it's like that one shot disables their automation, and then all of a sudden they're vulnerable and blah, blah, blah. I do want to see that. But it was adventurous. And I actually think all the cast for the first time really they all get some cool scenes to sort of be themselves. I think Nichelle Nichols actually gets a little more of that
Mm.
than in some of the other films, especially when she has the phaser on the young ensign. It's like, oh,
It's
you
for
wanted
adventure.
adventure? How is this for adventure? She's like, you didn't think I was exciting because it literally was being like, oh, you're old, you're sort of put out to pasture, and then they capture a starship. They commandeer a starship and go on space. That was great. So it was a fun movie, I think, for a kid, especially to be like, oh, we're going out to adventure again. Um, it was a bit hokey at times, certainly, and but I don't have an opinion. This is where I'm curious what everybody else thinks. This was sort of one of the directorial really from uh, Leonard Nimoy, so it has a different feel entirely, and I keep having to remember that. And does anybody else get the sense that he and the writers brought Star Wars into this a bit?
Mm.
Like,
Hmm.
like when they're off at the bar and the admiral's
Oh,
telling
yeah,
them
yeah. Okay.
this,
Awesome.
the aliens, everything else, it was sort of had a Star Wars vibe to it. It was like, oh, there's a galaxy here of other species to interact with beyond just sort of like the Federation regulars. So you got that brief moment of like, oh, there's cool stuff out there. So I really liked that in the sense they were giving, and it was a darker hued movie in many ways. So it had that. But yeah, I enjoyed it. Wouldn't say it's the best Star Trek film, but it doesn't deserve any ill will in my mind.
No.
It's sort of like
No.
a good mainstay Star Trek film, and you get to watch the Enterprise blow up.
Yeah, which surprisingly, and we'll probably get into this, the Enterprise blowing up is more impactful than the Kirk losing his son, because David was kind of just like, I don't know, thrust upon us in like one movie, and then he dies in the next. But I digress. Jack, what was your impression of seeing or memories of Star Trek 3?
No, so I think to echo on what Joe said and what John said. This movie for me, so I think I mentioned in a previous podcast, Star Trek 2 will always be very notable for me because it was my dad had taken my brother and I to the movies, and so that one it was just always will have just a memorable place in just kind of like my just development as a Star Trek pop culture aficionado. And this one again is coming 2 years almost to the day from the actual, Wrath of Khan. In fact, it was greenlit the day after Wrath of Khan opened, and so they always knew they were going to come out with a new one. Whether or not Leonard Nimoy was going to come back again, there were a lot of behind the scenes discussions with respect to that. I guess obviously allowing him to direct sweetens the deal a bit, making him want to come back even more. But one of the things that John said, and it's a very interesting idea in what they did in this movie. And in watching it again, it made me realize, on one level, this is the movie that truly allowed Star Trek to breathe. Because you had the show, and then the show did what it essentially did. Very opposite episodic television. One episode never really connected to the next. It was just really just kind of, we're on a different adventure, different writers. They had their, obviously their Bible that they'd hail to, but, that was just kind of how they were kind of keeping tabs on the show. The motion picture we've discussed. We're not going to rehash that right now. And then Wrath of Khan was unique because there was a lot of action adventure, but then it was calling back to one of the show's villains. But even the Wrath of Khan, even in and of itself, a lot of it was, either on the Reliant or either on the Enterprise or regular one. And so you didn't really get the full sense and scope of how big everything was. The thing I loved about this movie is it really brought the sense, and John, you touched on this, the sense of adventure that Star Trek had. Because essentially they are stealing ships. They're being chased by the Excelsior, which was introduced. They are going against Starfleet directly, much more directly than they ever had in the show. And so it is just allowing the franchise to really just kind of, we now have the budget. We now have, well-known characters. Let's have some fun. But it also did something else that was so unique that I think kind of set the tone for where Star Trek would go later on is that it allowed for continuing storytelling. The ramifications of what happened in the previous movie carry over. And so, as we said, we were introduced into David. And so one of the things in reading about the shows in, the Wrath of Khan, in that particular movie, the key things that happened there is Kirk gains a son, but he loses his best friend. In Star Trek 3, Kirk loses his son, destroys his ship, but regains his best friend. And so it's really putting Kirk in the center, but there are actual life events that are happening. Second one introduced, he was going through a midlife crisis, and in many ways that is reflected in all of the things that are happening in the course of his life. Take it from someone who is at that age where things dramatically start to change. Loved ones pass on. Things that you loved and cherished no longer work or are no longer available. It is almost, I find, this is the first movie in the franchise, the first kind of release that matures the franchise in a very realistic way. And then essentially even, Undiscovered Country picks up on some of the things that are raised here. And so this is what that maturation looks like, I feel. And so I think it's totally underrated. Is it a perfect movie? No. But it does things, I think, thematically, in the storytelling manner that really allow the franchise to truly breathe and just take new life.
Yeah, I agree with that, Jack, that point of like breathing new life, because this sort of like sets up sort of Kirk's like path for the rest of the movie franchise anyway, with resolving the death of his son, his relationship with the Klingons. That it's been so long since I've not seen Star Trek 5, but I really don't think it's addressed really in Star Trek 5 so much as picked up in Star Trek 6. So it's like, This is the beginning of Kirk's journey with his own inner pain and struggle. But I'll carry it over to Josh. What are your impressions of the search for Spock?
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on a couple of things that have been said. First of all, I agree. Star Trek 3 is an underrated movie. I think when I was a kid, like John, this was one of the VHS tapes that was most rewound and rewatched. It was one of my go-tos. I do have to quibble. As good as the Vulcan sequence is at the end, the best sequence in this movie, hands down, is stealing the Enterprise, I think, for my money. because it's got tension, it's got humor, it's got high stakes, it's got amazing visuals, it's got great music, it's got great visuals. It's just from top to bottom. I think it's a spectacular sequence. Yeah, so this was one of my favorites going back to when I was a kid, and it always confused me. This movie threw a wrench in the odd movie curse. I didn't really understand how the odd movie curse could work, because I was like, but Star Trek 3 is great. So what's the um but that said, you know, I think one of the main problems with the Star Trek movies, when they work versus when they don't work, is when I think the successful ones change the status quo. Because, lest we forget, this is a movie franchise that rests atop a television show. And I think when the movies feel like just another episodic adventure where nothing changes meaningfully for the characters or for their situation, then those films fall flat. So I think that is precisely one of the main issues with Star Trek 5. And I think a lot of the next gen movies, I think, Star Trek Insurrection holds no weight. I think, something you hear about that movie in particular is that it just felt like a big episode.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, and even First Contact to a degree. First Contact is great as a movie for many other reasons, but it does in it, well, I guess in certain ways it skirts that, because um, it establishes a new status quo with the Enterprise E, and with you know what these adventures, from the question mark of the ending of Generations, of what is the next generation crew, what are their adventures going to look like. I think uh First Contact answered that, and The Voyage Home reestablished the status quo after having uh basically uh, you know turned all the tables over in 2 and 3. In 2 you lose Spock, in 3 you lose the Enterprise, and you make our heroes into fugitives. And um I think for that reason, Star Trek 3, even though it looks cheap in certain sequences, not the visual effects. Actually, the visual effects are one area where I think um, it's actually stepped up, um, just in terms of the sheer number of new designs. Like, we forget, um, this is the movie that introduced the Klingon bird of prey, the Excelsior class, the um, the uh, the science vessel, the Grissom, um, a kind of look and feel for the Klingons that I think would carry over into the Next Generation era.
And the Klingon language actually took form in this movie as well.
Right. Yes, and the Klingon language as well. So there's a lot that's set up in this movie that's established here that will be with the franchise until the end of Star Trek Enterprise in 2001. Like the um, the design and the feel of a lot of it. It does look cheap in places. I didn't quite understand that or appreciate that when I was younger, but Leonard Nimoy, I think, um, shoots it a little bit flat. It kind of feels small when they're shooting the interiors. It sort of feels like TV. The place where the budget shows the most, and I think it's the least successful, are actually the sequences on the surface of the Genesis planet, where you can see or feel that it's a studio set. which in certain ways, if you're comparing it to the TV series, it doesn't really matter because that's also how the TV series felt. But on one of the director's commentaries, I heard that they initially wanted to shoot the Genesis planet in Hawaii, and I was just all of a sudden, imagining how those sequences on the surface of Genesis would feel if you had those, huge vistas, and you could see the sky, and you had that sense of nature and grandness, and ever since I heard that, I was like, yeah, that would have made that planet feel much more vast and mythic, and given it the importance that they say that it has. But that doesn't dramatically affect my opinion of the film, because I mean, as you say, um, the good vastly outweighs the bad here, and I just think it's a really important and, uh, for me, formative Star Trek story, and I will always love it.
No, Josh, excellent. Those are all good points of like how this gave us a lot of the richness that we have for Star Trek in this movie. Like, they were, I'm assuming at the time, just filling in the plot holes. Like, the Klingons need to speak a language. We need a. Well, originally it was the Romulans, right? That's why they got the bird of
Yeah,
prey. It was
right.
originally it wasn't a Klingon ship; it was a Romulan ship originally. But they had already built the ship while they were in production. So like, this is what we had to go with. And yeah, we got the Excelsior. Um, I agree. The stealing the Enterprise scene is excellent. The music, James Horner's music's excellent. Everyone's on their game in terms of the quips, the lines. Yeah, it's a fantastic. And the fact that that's the moment for the Enterprise to thrive is when it outruns the Excelsior. And
Well, the Excelsior doesn't really outrun the Excelsior.
well,
Scotty stuffed up the plumbing, right?
It's not quite a fair fight, but yeah.
Yeah. But then, to your point, James, and Josh's point, the scene where just as the Enterprise is outside the space station, and the music is welling up, right? And then you see the Excelsior come around the side of the space station, and for one shot, they're both in this one scene. They're both in the same shot, and you're thinking, "Oh my God, they got no chance of getting away." And then you realize, "Oh, Mr. Scott's handiwork paid off." But that is an incredible scene. You're right, Josh. That the music is amazing in that sequence. It really is.
And there's also that moment where, it's a small moment in terms of the time, but there's so much in there when Captain Styles, who's the captain of the Excelsior,
James B. Psyche,
yes, right, um,
Hill Street Blues.
and the dad on Doogie Howser.
Yes.
that's right. Yeah, that's right.
See, I know the Hill Street Blues.
When he gets on the comm and he says, he cuts to it and he's like, Kirk, if you do this, you'll never sit in the captain's chair again. And it cuts to Kirk, and you could read a lot into the expression on his face, but he doesn't hesitate. He gives the order to go to warp, and he seals his fate in that moment. So he thinks. And I think Shatner is really good in this movie.
He is good. Yeah, I would even though like the death of David, I feel like isn't amount to much just because of the character was introduced so quickly and they don't give a lot. His scene where he is selling, like Kirk's losing his son, I thought is particularly good. Like that misstep where he misses the chair to sit. I thought he's like particularly good in it. It doesn't quite land for the loss of the character, but I'm not always the big Kirk fan, but I was like this movie like really like I think is like one of the strongest Shatner Kirk performances in the saga.
I agree.
That's interesting because Kirk is out doing his thing again, and we're also looking at his strongest performances, or some of the strongest performances, and I wonder if the two are related. And does this mean that Leonard Nimoy really knew how to direct William Shatner?
I think it does mean that.
You wouldn't want to say that to them at a convention.
He previously directed him on an episode of T.J. Hooker, in which he was
I didn't
also
know that.
in the episode.
Really?
Oh yeah, he had directed 2 episodes of T.J. Hooker, and one of the episodes, Leonard Nimoy was in there. He was, I think, a cop hell bent on revenge on his daughter's rapist. But John, I think you nailed it. I think if anyone could really bring out what's in the inner Shatner, Leonard Nimoy was it. Yeah.
I don't know if it's so much bringing out as putting stuff back in. Think about it. He wasn't over the top. There was none of this hand wringing and none of that stuff, right? So, James, to your point about when he learns that David is dead, that stumbling back, that's a moment that you don't see in any previous Kirk. And Kirk lost, he lost Edith Keeler, he lost Raina. I mean, there's other people that were important to him he lost. So I think Leonard must have said, Bill, don't be spitting cotton here. Keep it, let's keep this, let's keep this in the verisimilitude, Bill, verisimilitude. Let's make it real within the context of the world. I think that's what's going on there.
There's some dispute about the stumbling on the chair and falling down. I may be mixing up who said what, but the gist of it is, Shatner said something like, this was him really being wounded. So this, shows him literally, being knocked off of his game for a moment, and then he recovers. Nimoy said the choice was genius, but he's sure that Shatner just missed the step and fell.
Sometimes you leave that stuff in
Wow.
because
A lucky accident.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that is incredible.
I have a couple of questions for our experts here. One has to do with space dock. I don't know how big space dock is.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense.
Please
It doesn't
explain
make
to
any
me.
sense.
Now, so I understand it. Impulse speed is just below light speed, right?
Yeah.
If you're leaving space dock, would you go to 1/4 impulse power? How many? What is that? Mach 19 or something? That's ridiculous.
I think they deliberately mentioned, because this has been such a fan debate, they make that part of Star Trek 6 where the Vulcan Valaris.
Yeah,
Yes.
Valaris, yeah.
Valaris.
Says, "Sir, regulations specify maneuvering thrusters only in space."
Yeah.
And he's like, "Quarter impulse." I think they really don't know.
I don't think they do.
A quarter is so much smart. That's a tiny fraction. Not really. Yeah. If impulse speed is like even half of light speed, a quarter of half of light speed is still an eighth of light speed. That's still really, really, really fast.
That's right.
Right. There's no way you wouldn't be like, and then you don't scrape the sides of the doors escape.
Splatter against it.
Splatter. So I think it's just sort of like, I think the fans have since been like, well, it's a logarithmic scale. Like
Okay.
a quarter impulse is actually really slow. When you go up to half, that's actually really fast. And full impulse is really fast.
Well, it's exponential, but in reverse.
Yeah, exactly. So, there's an explanation. You can always come up with something for it. And why in Picard season 3, the Titan with 4 giant impulse engines isn't outracing everything.
Right. I wondered that as well.
Impulse speed knows what impulse speed is. There are engines that pulse, right? Like
So just going back to the Stargazer, I just assumed with Picard it creates a more stable bubble. That is kind of my own rationale, because obviously, then all the starships would have just 4 warp engines, and then you just call it a day. I just kind of my headcanon is it creates a more stable warp bubble, so maybe it can stay at warp longer than the traditional 2 warp nacelles. Again, that's just one person.
There's technical trade-offs that we're not aware of, but
exactly. But Joe, to your point about the size of space dock, originally it was conceived of 3 kilometers long. But then as they were filming it, they said it's 5 kilometers long, which would make it visible from Earth. Okay, because that is how massive it would be. So yeah, there's a lot of in-universe kind of like, that's interesting. So.
mean, it's a base big enough to have the ship in it, and people hang out in the lounge watching ships,
No, it looks like a
disembark.
floating city in space. It's a space dock. I have no problem with the size of it. Just that,
Star Trek took some interesting direction with that in the Kelvin universe films, the final one.
Yes,
where they're on it was this Yorktown station, right?
Mm-hmm,
Yeah.
mm-hmm.
Which relates to how the Enterprise gets replaced, or one theory on. And when their ship is rebuilt at the end of that film, and you realize how massive that space station is. Well, yeah, that's 21st century technology, special effects. That in reality, these things would be mega structures.
Yeah,
and that first space dock is a mega structure. It's supposed to be, and in theory, it's also supposed to be a defensive platform.
Yeah,
and Picard season 3 makes that very clear that it's also
exactly.
a defensive platform for Earth, which is kind of cool because they didn't. Again, this is like early special effects. What can they do? What can they not do? I think they did pretty big. I always got the sense Star Trek 3 had a somewhat modest budget compared to, and that they spent a lot on literally blowing up a model of the Enterprise. That we got one shot at this. We got to get it right.
Got to get it right.
And they did. I know it was ILM, but still, I mean, they had a couple of phaser shots with the bird of prey. There wasn't a submarine chase and battle that you had in Wrath of Khan. So they were clearly like, how do we do this on a smaller budget and still make it dramatic? Oh, the automation goes out. Oh, the only way to get them is to blow up the ship. And James, I think to your point on that, I got the emotional. So you like as a kid, you're like, oh my God, the Enterprise. At the time, I wasn't not thinking about David's death, but I was thinking about like it hit me that like he lost a son. Even if this sounds awful, I couldn't get over his perm. David's perm. It was just such an 80s perm, and I was like, oh my God, like this is the future, but he still has the 80s perm. Little kid me was thinking that. I don't understand why.
Well, that's a good point. The girl seated at the in the Excelsior, right? When he's getting ready to go to warp, the woman that's seated to, I guess, behind the navigation station, she looks like Donna Pescow from Jack knows where that's from.
Yeah. Donna Pescow from the show, television show Donna, and also Saturday Night Fever.
Exactly. Yes. She looks like she's going to get up and disco dance before the ship goes to transwarp because of her hairdo. There are things in this movie that, and I have to say this. No, we're talking about it. Obviously, the budget was spent on the space dock and the death of the Enterprise, and I think at the end of the film.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they spent any money on wardrobe except for the Klingons and the Vulcans because everybody else looks like crap in this film. I mean, what in the world why did they put that outfit on Mr. Chekhov? He looks like a 10-year-old boy.
Well, Walter Koenig hated that outfit.
Can you blame him?
And when I think there's one scene where he's wearing the outfit he wears in Star Trek 4. I think there's like a very brief scene, and that's only because he finally told Leonard Nimoy, I don't like the outfit, and Leonard's like, why the hell didn't you tell me? Like this whole time. And Walter Koenig like explains like he was always like very referential of the director and the design department, so he didn't think he had a say in anything.
That is so funny.
So he was just like, okay, I guess this is the outfit I'm wearing, and meanwhile he could have Leonard Nimoy was like upset with him. He was like, you should have been told me. I could have put you in that other outfit for the whole show.
Meanwhile, Nichelle Nichols she specifically requested she preferred skirts, and the general uniform of that was slacks only. So they custom made her slacks, a skirt in the uniform and made it work. So it goes to show you, like you got to stand up for what you want. Yeah. Don't be afraid, especially if you have a goofy outfit that you're not feeling.
Well, I'm not looking forward to I'm not be around. None of us will be around, but if this is what fashion is going to look like in the 22nd century, man, it's like the 1970s all over again.
I was going to say, no one's referring to Sulu's leather shawl that he has on.
What the hell is that?
I don't know, man.
And Dr. McCoy.
He rocked that before.
No, Scotty looks okay. Kirk looks okay, and Nichelle Nichols can never look poor.
Kirk looks because that suit, because that little like his. What was it? A casual suit? What was it? What was it that he was wearing?
It was a pirate shirt. It's the precursor of the puffer shirt.
Exactly.
And
That's where
then
Seinfeld got the idea.
There
Okay.
you go.
and he has to wear it in Star Trek 4, obviously. They're like, oh, continuity, you know. And I was obsessed with that, watching Star Trek 4 and then realizing it was in Star Trek 3. Like, why were they wearing these things? And the kid was like, what in the world were they thinking? Well, this is what you wear when
I
you
see.
go.
Can't,
Good was-
can't gonna change
good
your
was-
clothes on Vulcan, obviously.
Right, right.
Yeah,
Oh
no,
man,
it's,
the ideas they had for this, I thought McCoy, you know, was pretty good. But you're right. Even though it was '83, it was very '70s
Yes.
fashion influenced.
yeah. Well, the jumpsuits are gone. The silver jumpsuits are gone. Thank God.
Oh, thank God.
But
Thank God.
you know, I don't know what they were thinking. The
But that's why I say it has a Star Wars feel, because the outfits were
Yeah.
'70s Star Wars, but then they were meant to be the sort of like, oh, they're wearing sort of like, you know, things that a rogue might wear, you know, and it yeah.
I think
This
they had
is
good
what it is
intentions, but they
when
just
the
didn't follow
Enterprise crew's off doing their own thing and they're on their downtime, and that was kind of cool to see. It was like them not just being on the Enterprise, not just being officers. It was, you know, what are they like out of that context? And seeing that, you know, Scotty wasn't just the I can get it done engineer. He was like, oh, I can mess stuff up too.
Yeah,
And
that's
how
I
he
love that.
really was offended by the Excelsior in so many ways because they were taking it away from the Enterprise, and the captain was just and they had to give you a captain that was going to be a contrast to Kirk. You know, the button up, they get the little like
Oh yeah,
thing he had. You
he's
know,
got his little stick. Yeah,
yeah, like
his
the
nail
whip
file.
I don't know, like it was
Yeah.
weird. It was really weird. It was like a Marine commandant,
Yeah.
you know, going around like, I will show you what I have, and it's a Starfleet captain. It's not the Marines. It's not brutal discipline of the sea, but he was that guy, and we were meant to hate him. We were meant to hate him, and we did. He's just like, oh, he had that mustache we didn't like. It was just everything you didn't like about the character. And then he's just on a big tub of a ship that can't move anymore. I like how they did redeem it with Sulu becoming the next captain.
Yeah,
And then Scotty says in Star Trek 6, like, well, that is one hell of a ship, but not so much as our captain, I think. You know, that line was so great. Something I wanted to quickly interject on the slightly sadder side is that people didn't have the reaction to Kirk's son's death, I think, because it was a little bit their relationship was so brief and movie forced. It's like, here's a movie, introduce them, they have this relationship. You can get a dump of all the backstory real quickly. So you're right, you're not forming that. But this is a second film that he's in, and it shapes Kirk in a lot of ways. I mean, Kirk for Star Trek 6, the idea of loss. So I feel like his death has more of an echo into the future of Star Trek than maybe the moment was captured. Though, I mean, I remember the impact of like, you son of a bitch, you killed my son. You killed my son. Like, I felt that. Besides the hair, I liked David. I didn't know until years later how he tragically died. I mean, he died at the age of 29, 1989.
I researched it.
Yeah, the AIDS epidemic, and had an infection, and his immune system was shot, and he died in 1989. And he's featured twice on the AIDS quilt for that. But it seems like he really had a career that was beginning to take off, and was quite talented. And obviously was not out at the time, but seemed unafraid to take on roles that were controversial. And it would have been. I mean, he did have a role in Next Gen in an episode, but it would have been interesting to know now what the son of Captain Kirk thinks. If he had made it to conventions and seen more of what that was, because it's Captain Kirk's son. It's a defining moment, and I think it really was a pivot point for Kirk in Star Trek 6. So this film, which one of you said, like, this got Trek, some breathing room. It really did set up some things for later that other films didn't necessarily do. Like, motion picture did not actually have a lasting impact as much on the mythos, except for the design of the New Gorgeous Enterprise, and that fine lines. How many times have people described that now in Star Trek? But outside of that, it didn't necessarily leave us with uniforms that stood the test of time, with aesthetics and characterizations. In fact, I don't remember. I mean, a lot of the characterizations from the first film really got tweaked in Star Trek 2 to how we think of them in the movie.
Yeah.
In the movies. So this film really has a unique spot because as much as, and I'm going to say it, I'm not going to defend it. I'm not getting into Josh's position. I don't think it's entirely unwatchable. I think it is enjoyable in its own right. It's just heavily flawed, and the budget cuts and the writer's strike and all the other stuff, whatever the stuff that was like really taking that movie down, did it. But its heart was in the right place. But it also has no lasting impact except for the camping scene. This movie gives you some impact. I like that.
Yeah.
To constantly use that falling Enterprise, burning up in the atmosphere, and the introduction of the Klingon bird of prey. I can't imagine it being a Romulan ship. That's a Klingon ship. It looks like a Klingon ship. I'm glad it is Klingon. I just don't understand how they size it, because that's another thing that you want to nerd out. The bird of prey design is used all over the series, especially Next Generation, but there are all kinds of different classes of them. They're just different sizes. But you don't know as a viewer what size the bird of prey is, because like space is relative. It's really hard to tell like which is the big one. But there are giant birds of prey and tiny birds of prey. Like this one is actually a very small ship with a crew of 13.
It's big enough to hold 2 whales and how much water.
Exactly.
Whales here.
John.
Though it apparently did have time for a full refit and overhaul in between movies. So maybe they added.
They took some Klingon crap out.
Yeah.
They desmellified it.
Sour meal.
I would say.
No, because the bridge set from this movie into the next one, it's just a completely different set.
Completely different.
Well, it's lit differently. What I noticed about the bridge set in this film, there were times it was dark. When they were going to use their weapons, obviously the condition red, and yet there are other times where it doesn't look like the bridge of a Klingon ship. It looks like the bridge of a Starfleet ship. It's too light. It's too bright. So I think that's a choice. Thank God they changed later on, obviously, in Next Gen. But and I guess there's one other thing I want to say about the David's death and the destruction of the Enterprise. Now we go back in time, 40 years and then 42 years to Wrath of Khan. Back then, of course, before internet, before chat rooms, before social media, somehow it got leaked that Spock was going to die. I went into that movie knowing that Spock was going to die.
Oh.
But 2 years later, I went into this film not knowing they were going to destroy the Enterprise. So for me as a Star Trek fan, this may sound crazy, it was a bigger shock and a bigger moment for me to see the Enterprise destroyed than to see Mr. Spock die. Because I knew that was going to happen. But that
makes total sense.
When they blew up the Enterprise, I was like stunned. I was shaking. I was like, I can't believe they did that. They blew up the Enterprise, But so
you arguably lost the main character of the entire series.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, so that's
my
really
God,
interesting.
Bones. What have you done? What have I done?
What you always do, turn death into a fighting chance for life. It was so dramatic, but it worked.
It works.
Well, that's really interesting, because I know that I don't know if it was Leonard Nimoy himself or the producers. They were furious when they saw the trailer that Paramount had made for Star Trek 3, because they show the Enterprise blowing up in the trailer, and they were obviously because and they were, the narrator in the trailer said join us for the final voyage of the Starship Enterprise or something like that, and then they had the shot of it exploding. For me, because I obviously wasn't old enough to see it in theaters, but the first time that I saw this movie, I also knew that they get a new Enterprise, and I knew that from watching Next Generation, I know that there are several more Enterprises. So that, combined with the fact that even though this is supposed to be literally the same ship that they were on in the original series, it doesn't feel like it, because it's completely redesigned.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, like, that was always it was kind of an intellectual idea that didn't quite hit me in the feels. The real thing that gets me, like you're all talking about, is the crew's reaction and Kirk's reaction. And I think, you know, there's that one shot when they're watching the wreckage of the Enterprise burn up in the atmosphere, and they're all like standing on that like uh, the cliff or that bluff or whatever, and you really, I think for the first time, you really get a feeling like these are mythic characters, you know, in a mythic circumstance, in a way that I don't know that either Wrath of Khan or motion picture or the TV series ever really tried to um, depict. But there was just something so weighty about the situation they found themselves in, and that shot in particular, it's seared into my mind. It's just like, you know, they feel like more than just mere mortals in that moment for some reason.
They're legends in that scene.
Exactly.
So
The other thing I just want to say real quick is it always really annoyed me, even as a kid, when they arrive at space dock and Commander Starfleet is saying that, you know, the Enterprise is 20 years old. We feel her day is over. It's not 20 years old. It's 40 years old in universe. It always drove me crazy.
Right. Yeah. Damn straight. Yeah. He was going back.
And even then, that argument doesn't make any sense,
right.
because we have ships in our Navy that, I mean, they've undergone refits, obviously,
Yeah.
But that have been in service for 60, 70 years.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Anyway,
that's a good.
So something that Josh, you kind of just touched on there is something that I kind of thought, and it's just like it's like a what if hypothetical question. But if you, let's say the events of Star Trek 4 never happened, the probe never came to Earth, they never had to go back in time, is resurrecting Spock, like what do you think Starfleet would do with them when they showed up? If they brought, like they did it, they successfully brought back Spock, would they be, what do you think Starfleet would have ended up doing with them? Is that enough to still get them kicked out, put in the brig? You know, I'm curious.
So that's a really good question. Again,
Great question, James.
As I indicated, I've been watching, you know, Star Trek Prodigy season 2, but also I've seen Star Trek Prodigy season 1, and one of the things I'm realizing, just within the whole annals of Starfleet, is the inconsistency. I mean, that always seems to strike me as odd. I mean, why everyone just doesn't do whatever they want? If the ends will always justify the means, I have no idea. Because essentially, I imagine if everything still happens the way it happens, let's assume that the Klingons are still there. You could always argue, well, we prevented the Klingons from getting the Genesis technology. And so everything that we did, even though we stole the ship and, you know, we were going for one reason, we prevented a greater evil from blossoming. And so this is always the challenge that I have with just the inconsistency of Starfleet, because obviously we're always looking at it from the perspective of, you know, the hero characters, whether it's Kirk, whether it's Janeway, whether it's Sisko or you know, Archer. They break the rules and it's okay, but I would really love to see it, and we kind of saw a slight hint of it in Court Martial. You know, just a line officer who makes a mistake, you know, those people get reamed, and their careers are just flushed down the toilet. Probably not great for morale, but I mean, that's a really good question. But I assume somehow they would have found a way to talk their way out of it, and everything would. It's fine. It's fine.
Because arguably, I mean, not that they know this in at the time of the movie. Arguably, saving Spock saved more lives than anyone. You go from unification, you go from everything else he has done after he was like he has saved more lives. But to your point, Jack, I was just thinking like Captain Shaw is the person who would be calling, like, you know, hey, what's going on with these people? Stole a ship, and
They stole a ship. They violated the general directive to go to the Genesis planet. Okay, against orders. They have this altercation. They destroy Starfleet property, which is granted, it's a cashless society, in the multi-trillions of dollars. Okay, and nothing.
Yeah,
you get demoted from admiral to captain,
which is ultimately what he wanted anyway.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. It's a good point.
I mean, the other what if I came away from that movie is there's a pretty good story with them just like being Fenris Rangers, not going back to Starfleet, taking that Klingon bird of prey and solving the universe's problems as that's like a good what if Star Trek story where Kirk gets to do whatever he wants. Anyway,
maybe they would have been inducted into Section 31.
Yeah, that's possible. That's a possible what if. But anyway, I'm spiraling out. But Josh, you wanted to chime in.
No, I mean, it is interesting because, like I think at the beginning of 4, they are prepared to throw the book at them, so to speak. And I mean, we love them because we love the characters and they're the heroes. And, we cheer when they do these things. It's also a lot of fun seeing people who break rules, especially when they're right. But yeah, I think we would have gotten some situation more along the lines of what you just proposed, James. Like, I don't think you can let them go with a slap on the wrist for the litany of crimes that they have committed. Sabotaging the Excelsior. To say nothing of threatening a junior officer at phaser point and locking him in a closet.
The best.
He deserved it.
Mr. Adventure, as he is credited in the credits.
Yeah.
We all cheered it. We all cheered in that scene.
Oh,
yeah.
So yeah.
I'm glad you're on our side. I think they were really lucky that the Earth was threatened by a massive unintelligible probe, and they happened to be the only ones that could save the Earth. Because if not for that, I mean, think about it. Like, he got a demotion.
The only ship in the quadrant.
Yeah.
That's happened more than once.
Exactly.
Kirk was demoted, and the rest of the charges were dropped. Like, I think because they realized, like, hey, they just saved all our asses. It would look really bad if we just all of a sudden, threw them in a cell and threw the key away.
Threw them in the brig, yeah.
I think that something smaller would have happened if not for the whale probe situation, because I think Starfleet would worry about these. Like, in the universe of the show, I think that the exploits of the Enterprise and their 5-year mission, and Captain Kirk were on their way to becoming legendary. And I think the idea that these previously model Starfleet officers could commit these very serious acts of, would you call it treason? No.
It's definitely I mean, in many ways
Grand Theft Auto.
I mean, it's a militaristic structure, so you're disobeying direct orders, and so
and not just like any little order where there's like gray area. It's like, do not go to this planet ever.
Because all over again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, even more than that, because Genesis is at the center of a galactic controversy. Like, it's a very delicate situation, and so Kirk is arguably risking more than just the welfare of his command crew and sacrificing an aging starship that was about to be retired anyway. He's also getting himself involved and throwing a monkey wrench into very high level diplomatic political crisis.
Exactly. Yeah. Good point.
Without even thinking about it.
Well, because
but,
the
you know,
needs of
That's
so
why he is
one
therefore I am.
out-
That is why I am
out-
therefore going anyway.
so James, to your point about the spin-off of them kind of going and doing their own thing as Defenders Rangers, there's a book that kind of touches on that a little bit. It's the book called Prime Directive by Judith and Garfield Reeves Stevens.
Can you read that?
And so they essentially they break the Prime Directive, and then Kirk is drummed out, and everybody else kinds of goes and do their own thing. They break up, and so in the books they've kind of touched on that. And then I was just thinking about like people who've broken all of these directives. The only person I've ever thought who's actually gotten reprimanded was Michael Burnham on Discovery, because she full on did a mutiny and she was just completely just thrown out, and on her way to prison until Lorca came in and needed her expertise. But it's interesting that we don't see that more often. And I think to Josh's point, yeah, obviously these are our heroes. We're looking at them, so obviously even if they're doing the wrong thing, they're doing it for the right reason. But I think there's also good storytelling to be had in looking at it from the other perspective.
Absolutely. Before we run out of time, we haven't even talked about like what do we think of Christopher Lloyd as Krug, because this is post Jim Benedictowski on Taxi, but pre Doc Brown.
Yeah.
So like, what do we think of his model of what I guess became like the Klingons that we know now?
Well, I don't think he's the model for the Klingons that we know now. I think,
Gowron.
I think they wanted, even though he had a lot of prosthetics attached to him, I think they wanted a face that people recognized. Just coming off a very successful TV show that was inexplicably canceled, by the way. I'll never forget that. I'll never forgive him for that, NBC. But no, he's Leonard Nimoy reined in Bill Shatner, but he didn't rein in Christopher Lloyd. They could have gotten somebody better.
Interestingly, not their first choice. Leonard Nimoy wanted Edward James Olmos. Adama himself.
Oh my God!
Yes, Adama himself was his original choice, but the studio felt he wasn't tall enough. He auditioned 3 times and he didn't get the role, and so then he insisted and held on to Christopher Lloyd. But that would have been a completely different movie.
Oh yeah, very much so. With a great actor like that,
I feel like he could have been even more brutal in a sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, yeah, because there's something about Krug in this movie, the Christopher Lloyd version, that like is a little bit, like camp.
Oh yeah,
like
also a little bit political. He seems to be on a mission. I'd say political, but like rogue. He doesn't.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, he's definitely.
To be speaking for the Empire itself. The Empire is actually, a movie later is seen as actually engaging in politics and diplomacy, which is very weird for Klingons, or for our perspective of Klingons at the time. And he was sort of like, well, I'm here. I'm going to do this. And he did seem like he was a bit of a lone wolf.
Oh yeah, he's there for self-aggrandizement. Yeah.
Well, so that I believe is the residue from, as was pointed out earlier, originally the villains were supposed to be Romulans.
Right.
So one thing that kind of cuts against our perception or the depiction of the Klingons in this movie is that they're portrayed as like scheming and secretive and conniving, and if you think about it, that is more appropriate for Romulans. That whole mindset of, well, they've created this weapon. They say it's not a weapon, but it's definitely a weapon, and they're definitely going to use it against us. So we definitely have to get it first, so we can use it against them before they use it against us. That paranoia is much more Romulan, I think.
I see that.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely gonna say that. And just to talk about the Klingons, like Jack, you sent me that video. The last Klingon on the ship is what, John Larroquette?
Yeah,
exactly.
Oh man,
Dan Fielding and talking about everything.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I mean, it's just like, before they were great. Okay.
So as I recall, the kind of offbeat casting of Christopher Lloyd, but also the casting of of other roles like James B. Skilling as Captain Styles. Nimoy specifically was very sympathetic to recognizable actors who got famous on successful TV shows
Mm.
who weren't um, given roles in movies because they were um, too associated. So the powers that the powers that be assumed they were too associated with those roles, and they were TV actors, so they wouldn't cast them in movies.
Mm.
And so, I mean, for obvious reasons, that's a a circumstance that Leonard Nimoy was very sympathetic to, and that's why he cast Christopher Lloyd, who was
Interesting.
very much associated with Reverend Jim on Taxi.
Well, arguably, though, to tee up a future podcast, it was a gateway to him becoming Doc Brown, which is one of the greatest characters
Yes.
of
Yes.
all time. So
Yes.
even though
Yes.
Krug was over the top, he
What
probably
Josh-
it probably
sorry.
paved the way for that role. So
Josh, do you know why they recast Kirstie Alley with Ryan Curtis?
So there was so she was only signed for Wrath of Khan.
Okay.
And so then it was a situation where coming back for The Search for Spock, rightly so, she tried to renegotiate her contract. And they said no. I think they just felt that the character was so inconsequential that they just recast it with Robin Curtis, who I think knew one of the producers, and that was one of her earliest roles as well.
Yeah.
But again, it usually just comes down to money. So.
Well, I liked Kirstie Alley better in the role. And it's not that Robin Curtis was Sophia Coppola in destroying Godfather 3, but I had to get that in.
Yeah, you had to. Oh no, but and I think most either fans or critics also feel that she was fine. But
I
Kirstie Alley was, again, just her look. Was very distinctive. And how she fully created this character we'd never seen before in Wrath of Khan, and so I think that, again, all of these discussions, what would have made it a completely different movie, I think the character of Savick would have endured much more so and resonated in the franchise had Kirstie Alley reprised the role.
Completely agree.
Well, we're going to wrap it up in a moment. But before we do, I just kind of want to give everyone an opportunity, any final thoughts or reflections or anything that we haven't gotten to in terms of The Search of Spock that anyone wanted to bring up.
I want to go back to Vulcan again, where Dame Judith Anderson, by the way, who played the greatest, in my opinion, the greatest villain in the history of movies, as Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca. She was fantastic. They must have spent a lot of their money on getting her into this film. But when she's that whole sequence when she's transferring Spock's Katra from Dr. McCoy back into Spock, the way that sequence is filmed, there's no grandiose music. There's no garish special effects. You see what's happening. It's very intense. And you see what's happening on the faces of the crew as they're watching. And I guess it takes all night because it starts seemingly at sundown, and then when it's over, it's sunrise. The tension is palpable, but at the same time, I found it, maybe it's because I'm getting older now, I found it very reassuring, that scene. And I thought about, why is it reassuring? Why wasn't I and I think it's and this is the theme for Star Trek, it's the melding of logic and humanity. Spock, McCoy. James, the id and the ego, superego, I'm not sure about that, right? But to form a more quote-unquote perfect union, or a more perfect being. And I think that's always been the message of Star Trek, obviously, is to rise above our humanity, take what we've got, and expand upon it knowledge-wise, and be better beings for it, be better people. So I think that scene encapsulates all that. And I love that scene for that. I really do.
Yeah, and it really, again, that dovetails right into first McCoy's I'm okay, Jim. And then we get the build up to the scene, like I said, very emotional of him turning around, and starts quoting the lines from Star Trek 2 Spock until he says your name is Jim. So
your name is Jim, and the eyebrow goes up.
Yeah. Any other final thoughts or reflections on this movie?
as I am always want to do, I'm gonna pull out the Roger Ebert review, and there's
Oh,
one
it's great.
particular. He gave it 3 stars. Yeah, so I thought that was good, but and I liked he kind of encapsulates what this movie does, I think, in a very good way. And so he says, "This is a good but not great Star Trek movie, a sort of compromise between the first two. The first film was a Star Wars road company that depended on special effects. The second movie, the best one so far, remembered what made Star Trek TV series so special. Not its special effects, not its space opera gimmicks, but its use of science fiction as a platform for programs about human nature and limitations of intelligence. Star Trek 3 looks for a balance between the first two movies. It has some philosophizing and some of the space opera, and there's an extended special effects scene on the exploding planet Genesis. That's the latest word in fistfights on the crumbling edges of fiery volcanoes. And so I kind of like that because if you really kind of think about it, in many ways, I think it really does that. And then I think to my earlier comments, me building off the great Roger Ebert, is I think that's why it is allowed to breathe. So it's essentially creating something new based on the first two. But I think the franchise also recognizes we kind of need to go in a new direction.
Yeah, well said. Well, I mean, I can't say anything more than what he wrote. He's a great film critic, so what can I say? John and Josh, final thoughts.
I mean, I think it ends where it begins. Is that it was mostly a fun film, which they hadn't really accomplished yet in the first two, besides being interesting and good. So I think coming off of being introduced to Star Trek 4, going to Star Trek 2, 3, and then going back to 4 was a fascinating journey for me. So you had to see the characters come full circle. And I felt like it was that stepping stone to the characters becoming a little bit lighter again, and a little bit more accessible in ways that they certainly weren't in the first film. And the second film was just too intense to really give us that. So I would myself give it about 3 out of 4 stars. I think as a Star Trek film, easily 3 out of 4 stars. As a film standing on its own, if Ebert can give it 3 out of 4, I'll give it 3 out of 4.
Well, yeah, it's high praise. Yeah, and Josh, we'll end with you today.
No, yeah, I love this movie. I grew up with it, so I may be a little bit biased, even though I think it does sort of lag in the middle. I think it sort of sags from when they steal the Enterprise to when they encounter the Klingons at the Genesis planet. I think it sort of dips. But yeah, I love this movie. I can't help thinking it's hard to think about this counterfactual, but I can't help thinking I read somebody say a while ago, and I haven't been able to get it out of my head, that they thought it was a mistake to bring Spock back because once you kill Spock, then to just resurrect him immediately in the next movie, even though they dedicated an entire movie to that resurrection, he thought that it cheapened the story and the point of the second movie, that you can't outsmart, you can't outrun death. And it is interesting too because, like I said, I think the Star Trek movies are most successful when they upset the status quo. And I think in some ways what Star Trek 3 is doing, the only reason it gets away with it is because it also sacrifices the Enterprise. So it's like you restore Spock, but you lose the Enterprise, as James said, arguably the actual main character of the whole show. But the Enterprise is much more easily replaceable than Spock, so they do the same thing again. And so I don't necessarily agree with this. Child me certainly wouldn't have agreed with this. But it is an interesting thought experiment. What would Star Trek have evolved into if Spock stayed dead? I don't know. And that said, I love this movie, so I don't mind not knowing.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I don't disagree with. I mean, I've said many times in the realm of comic books that I thought a lot of characters should stay dead. However, I don't think it's the case with Spock. But mainly, that's probably because like I'm watching this like most of us, that John and Josh and I like watched it like sort of in reverse order. Like I said, I started with Star Trek 3. Probably I watched Star Trek 4 or Star Trek 6 like before I went back and watched the whole thing, and Spock was always there. And then obviously I may have seen Unification before I even finished watching the entire run of the original Trek. So Spock was always there. So I was like, oh, it didn't ruin the movie for me that I knew they'd be successful at the end, and it didn't ruin Wrath of Khan knowing that he's going to go die because I saw him later. I don't know. I mean, yeah, I can see the point taken, but I think Spock is such an enduring character that the loss of maybe some more interesting storytelling. I think we still got a lot of interesting storytelling with the character being resurrected in the Star Trek universe. So,
no, and having gone through that traumatic experience of dying and then being reborn, if you lop off Star Trek the Motion Picture and get rid of Star Trek 5, then you actually have a very tight, cohesive story with one through line. Because Star Trek 6, I think, is actually more directly connected to, as you all were saying, what happens in this movie. And Star Trek 5 is very disconnected from what happens in this movie, and even Star Trek 4. Yeah. So to the point where like you have Kirk in 5 is very chummy with the Klingons. And I think it's of seeing the evolution of the characters 2, 3, 4, and then 6. I think is actually for me like that's the essential story of the Star Trek films. It's a quadrilogy, I think.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. So, well, we're going to end the here. To I guess some point we will continue on with Star Trek 4 because, as Josh just said, like Spock got some insight, and Dr. McCoy is looking for an insight. You mean I have to die in order to get your insights on death? Listening audience, I hope you enjoyed this look back at Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock. I, of course, could not have done this episode without the insights of my esteemed crew, so thank you, Joe.
You're welcome, James. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Jack.
Live long and prosper.
Thank you, John.
Well, this is what happens when we ask for adventure.
Yeah.
Good one.
And thank you, Josh.
This is what I get for missing staff meetings.
Listening audience, if you have comments, your thoughts about The Search for Spock, please put them in the comments page on Facebook and the Secret Origins of Mint Condition. We're also on Instagram, Secret Origins MC. And I'm toying around because I just found Spotify has some interactive things you can put up when we do this. They have polls and they have Q&A. So if you're listening to this, and I remember when I post it, take a look at the Spotify thing to see if I've listed a poll or a question that maybe you can answer. But anyway, we thank you for listening, and we will talk to you on the next episode.